On a muddy battlefield, armored knights once ruled with pride and power. But that day, everything changed. Ordinary English archers raised their longbows and turned the tide of history. Thousands of arrows filled the sky, cutting down the strongest warriors before they could even swing a sword. In just one afternoon, the symbol of medieval strength became helpless, and warfare would never be the same again. Number 1. The Knight's Golden Age meets a quiet threat. In the height of the High Middle Ages, knights were the undisputed heavy hitters of the battlefield. According to historical records, a knight would train from his teenage years to serve on horseback, equipped with heavy armor, sword and lance, ready to charge lines of infantry. These mounted warriors didn't just fight, they embodied status and power, signaling nobility, land holdings, and the feudal order itself. But at the same time, beneath the surface of tournaments and cavalry charges, an under-recognized shift was taking place. Long before the dramatic moment when archers proved dominant, the structure that supported knights began to crack. Military innovators and rulers started to invest in cheaper forces, foot soldiers armed with simpler weapons, and terrain began to matter more than purely shock cavalry. The knight's value didn't drop overnight, but the quiet threat was already on the map. Feudal lords still expected their cavalry to win battles, yet costs were rising. Armor became heavier, training longer, horses pricier. Meanwhile, armies began to include masses of infantry and ranged troops. So when the moment came, the knight's dominance wasn't freshly challenged, it was already being eroded. And in one afternoon, when conditions aligned, that quiet threat turned into a decisive blow. Number 2. The longbow. A simple weapon, a revolutionary force. The story of how archers rendered knights nearly useless starts with the weapon that looked unassuming, but packed a serious punch. The English longbow stood about the height of a man, often made from yew, elm, or ash, and required immense strength to draw. In England during the 14th and 15th centuries, this bow became more than just a tool. It became a game-changer in warfare. Experts estimate that draw weights, that is, how hard you had to pull back the string, ranged from about 80 to well over 120 pounds, with some claims of 150 pounds or more for the fiercest warbows. That meant an archer had to train hard from youth. Pulling that weight repeatedly required strong muscles and endurance. What this did, it delivered arrows with enough speed and force to make any cavalry charge think twice. Range matters. Archers with longbows could reach effective distances that left mounted knights vulnerable before they even closed in. Many sources list ranges between 200 and 300 yards for flight shots, and much less when fighting in battle conditions. At those distances, horses and riders couldn't easily take cover, especially when the ground was muddy or obstructed. Then there's the arrowhead design. The infamous bodkin point arrowhead was sharpened to a narrow tip, intended to punch through mail or weaker armor joints. Modern tests suggest that while high-quality plate armor could resist some hits, at closer ranges or at weaker spots, the longbow arrow could still cause fatal damage or incapacitate a horse. What makes this revolutionary is how the longbow shifted the balance of power. Instead of relying solely on flash and charge, commanders could mass large numbers of archers, place them strategically, and rain volley after volley of arrows. A skilled archer might fire 6 or more arrows per minute under combat conditions. The cavalry charge that used to decide battles now became a high-risk maneuver under arrow storm. The knights lost their near monopoly on battlefield dominance because the longbow changed the tech and tactics. In effect, the longbow is the quiet hero, or the quiet villain, depending on perspective, in the tale of how medieval warfare changed in one afternoon. The weapon was simple in concept, but when used en masse and with discipline, it became a force that made shiny armor and mounted lances look exposed and outdated. Number 3. When Knights Met Arrows, Crécy and Agincourt. In August 1346 at the Battle of Crécy, English longbowmen turned what was once a knight's world upside down. The French cavalry, proud, mounted in full steel, charged again and again into ranks of archers backed by infantry. The English bows, far cheaper and easier to maintain than the heavy cavalry, unleashed volley after volley, as the French horses plunged into muddy ground and horses sank under their riders. The heavy armor that seemed invincible proved a burden in terrain suited to foot soldiers. At Crécy, the arrows didn't just wound, they shattered the idea that knights could dominate by simply charging. Then in October 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, the story repeated with a vengeance. A much larger French force full of mounted knights and men-at-arms advanced across a narrow, recently plowed field bogged with rain-soaked mud. The English army, smaller but cleverly positioned, placed thousands of bowmen in flanks and used sharpened stakes to halt cavalry charges. The French knights, trapped between trees and churned terrain, struggled to advance. Their armor weighed them down, and their horses failed to carry them forward. Meanwhile, English arrows rained in from a distance, disrupting every charge. The French elite plunged into chaos. Many drowned in helmets when they fell. These battles illustrate the moment when knights, symbols of medieval power, ran into something they could not outfight or outrun: massed archery, terrain advantage, and tactical subtlety. What had worked for centuries' armored surge, lance and sword, failed profoundly when meeting a disciplined line of archers with reach and speed. The result? Battlefield dominance shifted visibly away from mounted nobility. The image of a knight in shining armor charging to victory was now vulnerable, uncertain. Instead, the bow became the new equalizer. One mounted knight could be felled by dozens of arrows before he reached his foe. That transformation happened not gradually, but in dramatic episodes. In one afternoon at Crécy, then again at Agincourt, the medieval world of the knight was forced to rethink everything. Number 4. Armor that became a coffin. At first glance, a full suit of armor looked unbeatable. Gleaming steel plates, knights marching forward like moving fortresses. It's the image that defines medieval warfare. But behind that image, there was a shifting reality. New research shows that by the time of Battle of Agincourt, 1415, and similar engagements, the armor itself was working against the knight. First, consider the weight. One study found that wearing full battle armor caused knights to consume more than twice the energy compared to fighting without it. This meant fatigue set in faster, especially when weather or terrain added misery. Now add mud, rain, slopes and stakes planted by archers, and the knight's mobility dropped sharply. Then consider the protection. Good quality plate armor did a good job blocking arrows, but not perfectly. Many tests and historical accounts indicate that most arrows didn't punch through breastplates. However, the key was the gaps in the armor armpits. Joints, visor slits, and limb protection were weaker. Modern experiments show that at close ranges, a bodkin-tipped arrow could dent or even penetrate a plate breastplate under ideal conditions. That meant that even if a knight was technically safe, he wasn't invulnerable, and he was increasingly vulnerable to smart archery tactics. Meanwhile, his horse, a vital partner in the charge, was far less protected and became a frequent target. An arrow that kills or disables the mount leaves the rider at the mercy of infantry and archers. So the armor that once symbolized dominance started acting like a liability. It slowed the knight down and made escape from a hail of arrows harder. Imagine advancing under heavy boots and steel plating, into ground churned by rain, with arrows thudding into the air and horses stumbling. That's how a knight could transform into a target rather than a breaker of lines. On battlefields like Agincourt and Battle of Crécy, the combination of massed archery, terrain, and heavy armor turned in favor of the foot soldier. In that critical afternoon, the shield of steel that knights once trusted became a living weight dragging them into defeat. Number 5. Ordinary men, extraordinary power. In medieval England, the rise of skilled archers didn't just alter battle tactics, it shifted social power. These archers were often free-born commoners, known as yeoman archers, who carried the mighty longbow into wars once dominated by mounted nobles. They were not born into status, not raised to command, yet they became central to some of the most decisive victories of their era. Laws enacted in the 13th and 14th centuries demanded that able men practice archery regularly. This meant even village lads, after their fields were tended, were trained to draw a heavy bow, aim, release, and when war called, turn into a weapon of range and survival. Think about it. While the knight trained for years and carried heavy gear, the archer trained routinely, built strength through repetition, and mastered the bow that changed the battlefield. Economically and militarily, these yeomen were efficient. The cost to raise a skilled archer was far lower than maintaining horse, armor, and retinue for a knight. Their value rose in wars like Battle of Crécy and Battle of Agincourt, where massed archery upended cavalry dominance. Their arrows flew down on horses, on riders painstakingly protected, and changed the social assumptions of warfare. Nobility didn't guarantee the upper hand anymore. These ordinary men gained extraordinary power when placed in the right tactical setup: favorable terrain, stakes to stop cavalry, and coordinated volleys of arrows. They could wield this power without ever engaging in the proud charges of mounted knights. They didn't need fame or titles, they needed discipline and deadly accuracy. On screen you can show this shift in status, the humbling of the mounted elite by foot soldiers wielding simple yet devastating weapons. It's a story of inversion. Where once social rank and armor defined victory, now it was training range and numbers. The yeoman archer didn't just pull a string, he pulled the strings of a new era in war. The twist is compelling. The knight stood for power and prestige, the archer for utility and mass. The result was that in one afternoon, the battlefield changed, dominance perched on horseback faltered, and ordinary men with bows rewrote what strength looked like. Number 6. The Aftershock. War Redefined. In the wake of battles like Battle of Agincourt and Battle of Crécy, the world of medieval warfare did not simply tick on as before. Instead, a seismic shift took place in how armies were built, how wars were fought, and how societies viewed their elite warriors. One clear change came from strategy and army composition. Armies that once leaned heavily on mounted knights charging headlong began to invest more in infantry, archers, and terrain-based tactics. The dominance of the cavalry charge was no longer guaranteed because the threat of massed archery made that tactic perilous. According to military historians, the era of unchallenged heavy cavalry was over once the longbow proved its worth. Next, the political and social structures that supported knights started to unravel. When armies relied less on mounted nobility and more on capable commoners with longbows and stakes in the ground, the notion that only noble birth guaranteed battlefield success began to fade. Feudal lords, who had spent fortunes on war horses, armor, and retinues, now found the cost-benefit dramatically changing. One scholar writes that the victory of archers opened the infantry revolution and forced a re-evaluation of the role of the men-at-arms. Then there's the technological ripple effect. The success of archery forced armorers, commanders, and rulers to rethink equipment and defenses. Heavily armored knights became vulnerable, and thus lighter armors, mixed forces, and new defensive measures gained traction. Fortifications were updated, field tactics changed, and the battlefield became more about positioning and numbers than about the dramatic charge of the knight. According to an English heritage summary, the Battle of Agincourt confirmed that cavalry charges against archers were disastrous. Moreover, this transformation had long-term consequences. The heavy cavalry that symbolized medieval warfare gradually gave way to more flexible forces, and eventually to early gunpowder weapons. The same parameters that made the knight king on the battlefield heavy armor, elite training, mounted charge, were undermined by cheaper, more numerous infantrymen and ranged weapons. Historical overviews of the 100 Years' War note that the war accelerated the process of transforming France from a feudal monarchy to a centralized state, partly because military change demanded new funding, logistics, and command. From a visual standpoint for your video, this is where the narrative becomes compelling. One afternoon, one decisive moment when archers did their work, and the ripples carried out across decades. The knight's world did not collapse immediately, but it tilted. The next battles looked different. The training of armies looked different. The very idea of how war was won changed. What appeared as an elite charge now looked like a relic, a stunning display overshadowed by a wall of arrows, a muddy field, and foot soldiers holding the ground. For a viewer, this means recognizing that the story is not merely about bows versus swords, but about how entire systems of warfare, society and power shifted. The archer didn't just kill a knight. The archer killed an era,